Thank you, Donald. I think you've covered my speech, so I don't need to say too much further. I was a bit worried about coming to speak to you tonight as part from the history group that's attended here, but there are so many people that I see here that have committed so much to Jackson's Landing and the community here and worked so hard that I felt that I couldn't let them down. So I thank you for the invitation and welcome you all here this evening. And Mary has warned me that the microphone does play up, so if I'm not speaking very clearly, if you let me know, and I'll try and address that. So as Donald said, I'm a resident of Jackson's Landing, have been for, my wife keeps telling me 15 years, but I think it's a little bit less than that. And I recognise a lot of faces in the room. I've also had the experience of being in this room twice before. Once for my granddaughter's birthday party, which was a good experience. And the second one was to face or address the community group early on in the development. As Donald said, it's never easy when you're a developer builder. There are always issues, and we felt that it was very important to involve the community, and that is why I attended the meeting in that particular time. I will admit that not all of the meeting was positive, but it was very worthwhile because one of the wonderful things about Jackson's Landing were the number of stakeholders involved. Donald mentioned a few, and the community had a big say in the design and the finalisation of the development. The introduction was to talk about myself and my work. I don't want to do too much of that, but I have been very fortunate to have and had a wonderful challenging career in the property industry, both in Australia and overseas, with many corporations, including Lend-Lease, which I was very proud to be part of. Highlights of my career, both good and bad, have been many, but probably the most relevant for today's talk is my role in the planning, development, construction, and eventually the marketing of the Olympic Village for the Sydney 2000 Olympics. This role I found to be very challenging, not dissimilar to Jackson's Landing in that there were a number of different stakeholders. And as the independent CEO, notice the word independent because one had to be with a joint venture between two of the largest property developers in Australia, Lend-Lease and Mirvac. And as you can imagine, that wasn't all fun either. And to see the Olympic Village change from housing over 10,000 athletes and then accommodating on any given day some 23 to 24,000 people in the village, now become the suburb of Newington, which I don't know if a lot of people have been out there, but it's certainly grown and become what was anticipated. I also had the good fortune during my time at the Olympic Village to meet famous past and present athletes and escort the Queen on my own, believe it or not, inspecting the Olympic Village. I tried not to do a Paul Keating as she was struggling to get up the stairs. And Nelson Mandela, who was visiting the South African team's accommodation at the time. I have made some notes because I didn't want to miss out on anything to tell you.
Sorry,
can you hear me?
It needs to be a little bit closer.
A little bit closer,
need to
sorry.
Eat it. Eat the microphone.
I'm not having dinner here, Mary, sorry. The important part of the village being the most important part or component of the 2000 Games gave New South Wales and Australia, and indeed the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, the opportunity to create a legacy. a mantra that has been the focus of Olympic Games past and in the future. Also, it was an example of government and industry working together to achieve a successful outcome. Where the Olympic Village differed from any other development is that we had the support of government, so we did not have to go through the process which I think is affecting a lot of developments now, and that is the planning process. And we had the support of all the New South Wales government's statutory authorities to achieve what we did. For example, the piping for the Olympic Village had to accommodate, as I said to you before, not only the athletes that were resident in the village, but on any given day, there were over 16,000 people in the village. So in terms of the piping had to be sized almost double to what would have been if it had been a normal suburban development. We were also fortunate that it had been the armaments depot for the Navy, and the 90 hectares of which the site consisted of was basically restricted to access. The rest of the site at Homebush Bay, as we're all aware, was quite contaminated, particularly Holkers Creek and a few of the other areas where you see mounds today. They were encapsulating all the remediation that was removed and treated and made safe for any leaching from the site. Before turning to the development of Jackson's Landing, it is important to understand what I believe is best practice in urban design. It's an integrated discipline and a large-scale process of designing and intentionally shaping the built environment. It is the complex interface between infrastructure, public domain, and development framed by contending social, economic, and environmental factors. I give you a quote from the founder of Lend-Lease, which I always found to resonate well, and one of the reasons why Lend-Lease has been so successful. Things have changed since his time, but it is still a wonderful company, and I have an ex-associate here tonight who was on the construction side, Eric Hemsley, who also lives in Jackson's Landing. He reminded me of that advertisement many years ago where the gentleman enjoyed his raises so much that he bought the company. Eric didn't have the funds to buy Lend-Lease, but it is a similar thing where we both bought into Jackson's Landing. Dusseldorf's quote, "There are two things in life. You can be out for the maximum amount of profit you can possibly squeeze from your effort, or you can aim at a reasonable profit and have a feeling that you leave something behind." And that was a quote directly from Dick Dusseldorf, the founder of Lend-Lease. Jackson's Landing as a model for imitation was the next point in my discussion tonight. I'll just conclude by saying probably Jackson's Landing was also one of the projects which I found very interesting but also very proud of, as well as a development of Docklands in Melbourne, which I was part of as well. So I have been involved in a number of large projects as a corporate developer, and I use the word corporate because it's not the same as being a private developer who take a lot more risks, I think, than the corporate developer does. Turning to Jackson's Landing, as we all know from previous discussions here, there's the long history of Pyrmont and the Pyrmont Peninsula, and I don't intend to go into that. But the landscape of the site, which was originally purchased in 1799 by John MacArthur for a gallon of rum. That's probably where the terminus comes in, Donald, I'm not sure. Who seemed at one stage to own half of New South Wales, to a purchase by Lend-Lease with financial support from others from CSR, the site, at $75 million in 1996. The 11.7 hectares site, with a varied and rocky topography, remains of many once impressive industrial structures, erratic street patterns, and severe remediation problems, has been transformed into a vibrant harbourside community over a period of 16 years. As you can imagine, over a period of 16 years, the property cycle changed a number of times. And I don't think many developers would have been able to maintain a holding of that site over that period of time. However, Lend-Lease were committed and did so. As with the Olympic Village, a number of stakeholders, including community representation, were involved in working together to review the initial design. The outcome was to replace what was then an expensive and complex scheme with a more simple and more organic design for both active and passive outcomes. JL, an abbreviation for Jackson's Landing, is one of a number of planned communities which have become popular in Australia. These developments are based on the idea of offering a package of houses, apartments, open space, and community facilities such as pools, gyms, and tennis courts. High-density inner-city developments such as Jackson's Landing are seen as one solution of urban sprawl in Sydney. Now, the question to be answered is, there is no doubt that Jackson's Landing influenced obsolete industrial trial tracks further west, such as Rhodes, Homebush Bay, and Parramatta. But is this model worthy of imitation? From a large developer perspective, and personally, it would be difficult to imitate a development like Jackson's Landing, and that's for a number of reasons. Size, and as I mentioned, planning issues. I'm aware of one development in Glebe, which has still not been approved after being with council for 5 years for an outlay of tens of millions of dollars. And along with economic reality in actually producing a development of this size, it would be very difficult, as I said, to imitate. Government certainly has a number of holdings, land holdings and asset holdings, which could be utilised working with the industry to create similar developments, but is too focused on other priorities in terms of transport, as I was talking before about urban sprawl, the infrastructure to support these homes. I had to go out to Bringelly the other day, and I couldn't believe how that area has grown. It was just packed with housing, no trees, and hardly any transport for the people to get in and out of their areas. And the current government are revisiting some of the proposed transport arrangements, so it'll be very interesting to see what happens with that. Various commentators in the industry, and by the way, I'm not an architect and I'm not a builder. I have a financial background and development background. But some of the issues that have been raised by commentators in the industry about what they saw in Jackson's Landing. And basically, apart from all the positive things that have been said, I focused on the negative commentary to support what I was saying. It would be very difficult to imitate. For example, there is criticism that urbanism today is skewed towards profit, and the general character of areas, in our case Pyrmont and the Pyrmont Peninsula, are contrasted with a new waterfront village, for example, Jackson's Landing. Remembering Pyrmont's history, which, if you've attended previous meetings here, that has been discussed in great detail, but one of the aldermen at the time quoted in a book that he was shell-shocked, Pyrmont was shell-shocked, denuded areas, the site of large-scale vandalism, the fabric of community had been torn to shreds again and again. And that was a quote from a book called Pyrmont and Ultimo Under Siege. It makes for very interesting reading. And it wasn't really made to focus on CSR, for example, who were the major landowners at the time, but about the deindustrialization process in general. This influenced the name, rightly or wrongly, Jackson's Landing. And by that I mean Pyrmont and Pyrmont Peninsula at that time did not have a very good name. So Jackson's Landing really became the name to differentiate from the Pyrmont and Pyrmont Peninsula, which is a shame because Pyrmont has its own history. But again, from I suppose an economic point of view, the associated marketing collateral and the name represented what we have today and contrasted with the general character of the Pyrmont Peninsula. Government has always, with community support, promoted a working harbour policy. Balancing this with economic forces is always difficult. Whilst acknowledging Jackson's Landing is an active waterfront for a working harbour, suggestions have been made that the master plan was hurried and diagrammatic with the predictable street patterns, building heights and end users. And I find that hard to accept because, as Donald mentioned in the introduction, there were, I think, 8 to 10 different architects involved in the buildings and the design of Jackson's Landing to provide that differential in terms of the aesthetics of the development. The other criticism that around what had been done with the heritage items on the site was that retention of the facades was meaningless as the context of the buildings had been removed, i.e. the rum store. And I don't agree with that either because they've been converted into and the stables, they've been converted into really successful residential developments as well as the new buildings, but still retain the essence of those heritage items. Just digressing for a moment, I was interested to read in the Sydney Morning Herald yesterday an article by Andrew Hone from his book, The Place Economy, encouraging government and industry to work together to turn dead, dark and damned prime real estate, woefully underutilised into public amenity. The examples he gave were the Goulburn Street car park. He was proposing to put a park or a garden on top of the Goulburn Street car park to encourage use in that area rather than just being quite a desolate space. and the remnants of the monorail. I've often thought that the one there by Darling Harbour would make a really good cocktail bar in the evenings because it's got the best view, and he raised that as well. That was one of the elements that Sydney probably would like to forget in a hurry. Certainly cities around the world have created dynamic destinations which are revenue positive. One that I've actually been to, of course, is the High Line in New York. I'm sure a lot of you have been there as well. And that was amazing, an amazing turnaround of a disused rail yard. So I think we've been lucky to have had a developer-builder like Lend-Lease, ensuring design diversity and excellence over 30 different projects. Even 30 different projects, you say that again, we have a population here, I think, around about 3,900 now, but you never feel that it's overcrowded, which I believe is setting a standard in urban regeneration. So I don't think I've answered my question. Can Jackson's Landing be imitated? Are there better models to create long-term public benefit? I guess I'll leave you to ponder that overnight. So thank you very much for your time. I hope you gleaned some good information from that. The project in value probably at the moment is in the area of $1 to $1.5 billion. So it's certainly changed a lot from the gallon of rum that John MacArthur so graciously gave someone. So thank you once again for coming. Thank you for listening to me. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you. I've had questions of the community group before, but certainly...
Do you think that construction in New South Wales, particularly of residential accommodation, is over-regulated? Is over-regulated. I'm amazed often at the number of independent reports about this, that and the other being needed to build an ordinary two-storey dwelling house in the suburbs. Do you think all of this is necessary? And the expense involved, I suggest, must be phenomenal.
It's a very good question, and residential construction is very, very different from any other construction in that the detailing has to be absolutely spot on. As Donald mentioned before, in terms of the elements that go into residential construction are extremely important. What I've noticed lately with the introduction of the building commissioner, regulations are much harder to follow and indeed costly. So that's going to flow through with the additional increase in costs that we've had because of the war and also the leftover from COVID. Supply costs are coming back slightly at the moment, but are still going to be at a very high level. So to answer your question directly, I do think there is a need for regulation to ensure that all our homes are constructed properly, but to what extent that is, and that's another reason why I'm so proud of Lend-Lease, because of the focus in construction that they gave this particular development, and there are other developments as well. I hope that answers your question.
Hi, my name's Peter. We're going to be new entrants to Jackson's Landing, so we move in a month's time. So hence this I thought was quite interesting timing. If you could have your time again and go back to when it started, is there something that you might have done differently? I guess part one and part two. Is there something that I guess you're exceptionally proud of now that you've lived here for some time?
Yep. Well, welcome to Jackson's Landing, firstly. You've made the right choice, so I'm pleased about that. Would we have done something differently? Perhaps the only thing I can think of is that we should have been more on the front foot in terms of putting our DAs into for approval rather than waiting until markets changed. So what I'm trying to say there is that perhaps we could have developed the site out quicker than the 16 years. That's a general overall observation. Living here now as a resident speaking, I really enjoy everything about Jackson's Landing. Not only the amenity and the public spaces, but also the convenience of where we're located in terms of getting places, and it's going to get better and better with the fish markets. Unfortunately, I think with future residential development, the government need to do something about the roads in terms of the number of increased owners and people buying the apartments. But I don't think, apart from that, I don't think there's anything else we've done any different. We did have some issues with a couple of the government authorities. For example, we were trying to get a wharf, which we have a wharf, but this was to house boats and so on off the front, but the maritime services and the Port Authority wouldn't allow that to happen. But apart from that, commercially, we had one building, the Nokia building, down at the end of Bowman Street, at the corner of Bowman and Harris, and we did have a site there which we tried to get a development that, because there was a lack of market requirement for another commercial building, we did go to council and ask if we could do, if you like, a dual building. In other words, if there was commercial requirement, we could fulfill it, but if not, use it for housing or apartments, based on a different concept, because commercial floor-to-ceiling heights are much larger than residential floor-to-ceiling heights, and it would have been quite a unique development. But in the end, council made it so difficult that we sold the site, and that was the one thing we had. Long-winded, but I hope it answered your question.
Interested, my limited experience, this is an extraordinary community here that I'm unaware. What part did Lend-Lease play in establishing this as a community, or did it happen through the activities of Mary and Don and others, or a combination? But did Lend-Lease play an active part in establishing this as a community?
I think, as I mentioned in my talk, it was a balance of all stakeholders, and there's no doubt the community, mentioning Mary to embarrass her and Donald, that put in so much effort and still do. I mean, I see Mary going into the gardens around the place, making sure everything is good. And that's the type of community that's being created by those people. Lend-Lease probably supplied, if you like, the facility overall for a community, but the community have responded, and it is a close-knit community. I see a lot of people, as I said earlier in my talk here tonight, that have become friends, even if you just wave to them in the street. It's good to see. But thank you for raising that. It's an important element.
Sorry, I think you could add that for the first few years of Jackson's Landing, Lend-Lease organised Christmas parties, for example, and entertained people on the other side of Harris Street to make sure they were not affronted by the development that was happening here. So there was a social investment of some kind and of some size.
Yeah, I think that's right. That, as I said, all stakeholders were involved. I didn't want to mention Christmas parties and so on because I think it was more important that the strength of the community has come over time, particularly over the 16 years. And yes, developers, particularly Lend-Lease, go out of their way to engage the community in different ways.
Thank you for your talk. I'm wondering, it's an urban planning question that I have, first off, because it does seem remarkable to me. I think this was, at least at some point, the densest part of Sydney. I think it's been taken over by Green Square now, but it was this end of Piermont. And yet one never felt pressed in by people. It always felt open. Is that a function of the amount of building and up, of course, not taking the ground space, to the open space that was created here, including the water, obviously, which is successful? And is that a sort of formulaic thing that is required by councils and other approvers in order to ensure that there's a good living space for people? So are there increasingly accepted standards for this kind of building? My second point, which is sort of related to this, is if we were doing the design now for Jackson's Landing, what would be the effect of having to consider the climatic potential changes, the heat levels that are going to be coming our way, and so on? And are you thinking about that? And is planning changing as a result?
Yes. To answer the second part of your question, I've put a fact sheet on the table outside for you to read. Sustainability wasn't focused on at the time. However, there were elements of passive design, wastewater management, etc. throughout the project. There is more of a focus now with the shortage of power through the use of coal and so on. So if you were doing it today, there is no doubt that there would be more ESG elements involved in the precinct. But having said that, I think at the time, Lend-Lease were ahead of the game in that. There was no measurements as they have today in terms of star rating, but certainly did that. As to your first question, first part of your question in relation to planning, an interesting one. Different councils have different approaches to planning. And I think the planning system, which has been under review so many times, and we get promised, we, the community and the developers, that the government will interpose themselves where they thought things were necessary. And what we're seeing now is that they've let that wander, and we have a shortage of housing. We see certain members of parliament making noises about affordable housing, in communities, etc., but it doesn't really happen. And yes, councils do dictate open space, but I think it's upon the developer to ensure that we do a good design that's acceptable. Now, as I said earlier in my talk, there's 3,900 dwellings in Jackson's Landing, and as you say, we don't really notice that many people. But if the planning laws don't change, and particularly some councils, we're going to face even more problems in the future.
Hi. Are you hearing me okay?
Yes, I am.
Another Peter.
Hi, Peter.
Hi, Hugh. Thanks, that was very interesting.
Thank
one
you.
thing I'd like to say about Jackson's Landing, which I'm particularly impressed by, having lived here for some 7 or 8 years now, is the generosity in the size of the apartments. So relative to most other apartments that have been built in Sydney over the same sort of period, they're relatively oversized. And I think this has gone a long way towards creating that sense of stability and long-term living, and hence a strong community. So I guess the question that's coming out of that statement is, was this well, it must have been a conscious decision taken by Lend-Lease at the design stage to brief its architects to create this generosity of apartment size. Can you comment on that to some extent?
Yes, certainly, Peter. I mean, we also have to bear in mind that this development was finished 16 years ago, and the increase in site costs, the increase in building costs have reduced the size of apartments today. You find, for example, that Mirvac has reduced the size of its two-bedders. Even one bed is small as 75 square metres. So we were fortunate that we were in a time when it was important to provide space for people leaving their residences in the suburbs to come into apartments. And yes, that was a factor in the design of most of the buildings.
It's veering off topic a little bit, but I want to talk about actually the parklands,
Yes.
which I find fantastic around here.
Yes.
I love the natural feel about them, the little walkways, the pathways, and I was really quite appalled at the three options that they offered for what's possibly going to happen as they open up towards the fish markets.
Yes.
And to me, it all looked like a repeat of the Rainbow River. It's all very built up and it's all very stepped, timber and this and that. And I was quite concerned, and I thought, why can't we have the same look going around? And how does one go about putting a bit of pressure on the designers or the selectors on
Yes.
what parklands we're going to get?
Yes, I couldn't agree with you more. Mary probably has a view on that as well, but yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, there is a question over the house that sits on the corner of Bank and Bowman Street now. I think a survey was taken, Mary, was whether to keep it, knock it down or change, I don't know.
That's still going on as a conversation.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. But it would be nice, but then, unfortunately, economic reality comes into it with the government and the land owners, which are some private owners too, that are associated with the fish markets. They're really trying to achieve the best financial outcome as they can. However, that's where, planning does come in, and if it's used sensibly, to try and control that. And understand, I just find now that I'm getting a lot more grey hair than I had, the aspect of vision is missing. There is no vision anymore in terms of our city, I don't believe. I keep forgetting the minister's name, he's not a friend of mine, and he keeps coming out with these wonderful schemes and is seen swimming in the new ocean pool and so on. But there is no vision about the future. I mean, as I said, I went to Bringelly and I couldn't believe it. The housing was wall to wall with no vegetation and lack of transport. So, look, I'd love to see it like that too. But
Thank you, Hugh. I'm another Peter as well.
hi, Peter. Full of Peters tonight.
Hugh, you mentioned the legacy of CSR.
Yes.
And that you certainly did incorporate some of that. How important was that as a design feature in your process to try and recapture or at least retain some of that original CSR architecture and origin and function?
Yeah. It was an important part of it, Peter. As you can see, they used to make canines, CSR, those big steel balls you see in the park are what they crushed the canine with. And as I said, some of the commentators criticised keeping the old buildings, basically the facades, and restructuring them inside into apartments and so on. I think Sydney has lost a lot of its heritage of the past, and it's only in the last period of time that people have become conscious of some of the old buildings to try and retain them, as long as you have a usage for them. And as I said, the criticism that was loaded onto Jackson's Landing was, whilst we kept the facades, the context of those heritage buildings has been lost. I don't know how you would replace that because all those industries are no longer. So I think, I mean, I had an experience once with a company I was working with that was ordered by planning and the City of Sydney to retain a facade in Hunter Street. And the facade fronted Hunter Street, nothing behind. And when we started construction or demolition, we had to brace the building, which we did, and had safety inspections, etc. But underneath the ground, it was on brick pillars. And over the years, with Telstra, the water board, and drilling holes into it, it collapsed in the middle of the day on a weekday. And it got me thinking then about facadism, as they called it. And so my point is that there are some buildings worthy of retaining, and there are some buildings not worthy of retaining. And I think the buildings that have been retained on the site, the stables that are on store, Regatta Wharf, a few others, really deserve to be retained.
I'm hugely impressed by your stamina in coping with this. So just once more, I'd like to, on behalf of the people who enjoyed this talk, to congratulate you on the work that you did here and on the reflections that you shared with us about it.
Donald, it wasn't only me. There was huge teams, and
Really?
I had Roy and HG actually at the Olympic Village. We had a dining room facility, and we had like a soft opening to test the kitchens. I'm sorry, you can't hear me. We had a soft opening to test the kitchens, and so we organised a function. And Premier at the time was the gentleman with the glasses. I've forgotten, it's called dementia, but I'm getting there slowly. But anyway, Roy and HG gave a speech, and they said, and to the man who built this whole village by himself, brick by brick, which was not true. And the teams that we had at Lend-Lease were just amazing, fantastic. In Jackson's Landing, and the Olympic Village with a combination of project management, construction supplied by Lend-Lease, and the marketing, sales and design by Mirvac just complemented one another. But you can't do these things without good teams, and I was fortunate enough to have good teams.
And as we know, you can't have good teams without a good leader, and that's what we've been exposed to this afternoon. On behalf of everybody, I'd like to thank you for this marvellous presentation, which has modified our views of Jackson's Landing and Lend-Lease, all for the better.
Thank you
for that.
It was better than the last meeting I had here.
So thank you very much.